Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast. Our podcast series features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to quality early learning and care, with a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. You're most welcome to this special edition where we discuss the 5th Early Childhood Ireland Barometer, which, as you know, was announced last week. To explore these issues, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Frances Byrne. Frances is the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Campaigning in Early Childhood Ireland and has a huge interest in advocating for children in early learning and care and school-age childcare settings in Ireland, and for the member settings in which these children spend time and are cared for and learn. And this relates to government policy and campaigning for improvement in that regard. So, Frances, you're really welcome to this episode.
Thanks, Maura.
So, Frances, maybe if we start with some background to the barometer.
So, Early Childhood Ireland has been commissioning REDC, which is a national polling company. People will often see them quoted in the newspaper about political party support and so on. So since 2018, REDC has been carrying out a national poll, and we have been tracking 4 questions since then. We added one in 2019, and then every year we have 2 or 3 questions that are new, that are usually to do with something that we would like to find out in Early Childhood Ireland about national support, or a few years ago we knew that there was going to be policy development to do with childminders, so we asked a specific question about childminding. So we're delighted. 2022 is our 5th national annual Early Childhood Ireland Barometer.
So, Frances, what are the key messages that emerged in this year's barometer?
So the highest level of support in this year's barometer is really excellent news for all of us who care deeply about children and their rights. So we have put a statement to the Irish public, which is every child should have the right to free, high quality and accessible early years care and education. And 80% of adults agree with that. REDC also provides us with demographic breakdowns according to region, gender, work status, age, social class, and parents or non-parents, if you will. And what's really exciting and very positive is that across the board, the support is up at really high levels, and it actually dips over 80% in some of those demographics. So it's very, very powerful support for the broad agenda around children.
80% is a huge level of support across all demographics, like you say. That's really really strong support. So I suppose in a way we might be able to preempt the answer to my next question is, how does the public feel about the actual investment in early learning and care and school age childcare? Is there support for increased investment in kind of parallel with that support for the broad statement?
Absolutely, Maura, and I think what's interesting is we have some tracking questions that are looking at, trying to answer that question of who pays. But we asked a specific question this year based on a commitment that the government has made, which is about the percentage of gross domestic product that is spent. As listeners will know, in Ireland we spend the least of all the countries that are measured by the OECD, and we're spending about 0.2 of 1%. For contrast, Sweden would spend 1.9%. UNICEF has said that countries like ours should be spending 1%. So we asked that question about whether Ireland should increase to get to that 1%, and 72% of the Irish public agree. However, we have an interesting and maybe depressing demographic in this one, which is that there's a gender contrast where we have 75% of women agreeing and only 69% of men. So I'm quite surprised by that, but I think it's interesting because I think we're still at a situation in Ireland where caring in general no more than the caring and education of young children, it is very much seen still as women's work. And perhaps that's why, but that's certainly interesting and quite worrying. In some ways, not to take away from the high levels, the 72%, and 69% is still a good figure, but it's quite a contrast. And given that most of our decision makers, our elected ones, are men, that tells us we and other organisations, it's not just Early Childhood Ireland's work, have a bit of work to do about that. But nevertheless, that's a very high level of support at 72% across the board.
It is. But yeah, like you say, it is a bit worrying that the support, the majority of the support is from women. But and I suppose, we know that most of the workforce are women. So do you want to talk a bit about the workforce aspects of the findings, because that clearly has an impact on the women working in the sector?
Yes, and for Early Childhood Ireland, it's such an important issue because, of course, in the inclusive, high quality early childhood and care system that we want, it's really important that staff are paid appropriately. They have proper terms and conditions, because it's a critical element of that system happening. So it's really, I think, very positive to see that the support is at, again, 73% for proper terms and conditions for those staff in the sector who are as qualified as other professionals, such as nurses and teachers. And we put the question that way, and we have done so for 4 years, because 4 years ago there was an EU guideline was published which said that by the end of this year, all childcare staff, as they put it, across the European Union who work directly with children and are should be as qualified as other professionals, and if so, should get the same terms and conditions. So it's very buoying and positive, but it's not surprising because, as you will know, Maura, our social media platforms can often be clogged in a positive way with parents who are either during COVID or at the end of the year, so to speak, the ECHE year in particular, will often take to social media to sing the praises of the educators who have looked after their children, as they would see it, and whom they trust every day. And they really value that relationship piece, which, experts like you and a lot of our listeners will understand, and parents don't necessarily have or are aware of the academic understanding of that, but they know it as parents, how important relationship is, the quality of the relationship. And of course, all the evidence shows that. So it's not surprising, but it's very encouraging. And it's particularly encouraging, as you have said, we reflect on the fact that 98% of the 30,000 or so staff are women. And, there's no doubt that across the world, but we definitely have a problem in Ireland, we don't value care work, paid or unpaid. It is largely seen, as I said, as women's work. And traditionally in Ireland, an awful lot of women, largely mothers, have carried out that work, in inverted commas, for nothing. And the transition then into an earlier system which encompasses, for example, the ECHE scheme, which is fully paid for by the state, we still haven't seen the same level of terms and conditions that we see in those countries like Sweden, where pedagogues, as they're called, are as valued as teachers and are compensated accordingly. So that's, that is front and centre of our advocacy work, because we completely understand in Early Childhood Ireland, first of all, the rights of those staff to be compensated properly, but also their importance in the lives of children, the centrality of relationship and qualifications. And so we fight for that every day. So it's great to have the support of the Irish public behind us.
Yeah, that loving, trusting, caring relationship between families and children and staff. I always describe it as a triangle with the child in the middle, and the tighter that triangle is, the better the outcomes are for children. So it's like you say, at the end of the year, times like the pandemic, it was actually really gratifying to see the broad support from parents describing the impact and the support they felt from their settings, and just needs to be, the funding needs to recognise that in a very meaningful way from now on. It's past time. So, I mean, we've said, Frances, that the barometer is there 5 years, and you've mentioned some of the trends. Are there other trends or changes in opinions that you want to draw to people's attention?
Well, I think when we look at our 5-year tracking questions, it's really interesting because anyone who looks at the barometer on our website, earlychildhoodireland.ie, will see that last year some levels of support fell. Now, interestingly, and again, I'm sure this is down to the pandemic, the one we've just discussed didn't fall. It stayed consistent. In fact, it increased over the pandemic from 67% to 73% in 2021, and it has stayed at 73%, as I said. But interestingly, last year, the question that we asked about the education of children under 5 being as important as the education of children over 5, and we would have consistently been up in the 70s for that. And last year it fell to 62%, and we were a little bit downhearted about that, but it's up at 71% again. So that's very interesting. And when we discussed that with Red C, they felt that and other areas that slightly fell were a manifestation of people's concerns. So if you think back to January 2021, we didn't have vaccines. We were all very worried, and they think that there were economic concerns, that people were thinking, well, yes, I might think it's as important, but who's going to pay for it? Because our other questions about, similar to primary education in Ireland, childcare should be available free to all children. That fell from 68% to 61% last year, but it's up at 75%. So 3/4 of adults believe that, like primary education, early years care and education and school age care should be free. One of the interesting findings that I always keep an eye on, because I think it's a really important one, and I think that people think, oh, Early Childhood Ireland, they're concerned about the 200,000 children who are in settings every day, and of course we are, but we're concerned with the all aspects of early years from birth. And so it's interesting that one of the questions we've asked for 5 years, or one of the statements, is all parents should be financially supported to stay at home with their child for the first 12 months of the child's life. And again, we had high levels of support, and that dipped to 58% last year, but it's up again at 63%. And that's really, really important, because we know that one-on-one care in the first year is absolutely vital in most instances. Of course, there are families that need extra support, and we also know that our members across Ireland provide that support for those families, and of course that's important. And we know that childminders, as well as providers and educators, can be so important in that first year. But we also know, and again, to look at it through a gender lens, we know that men aren't taking up parental leave as the same level as mothers. So we have a situation in Ireland where the first 6 months of a child's life, mothers are financially supported, and then it becomes a choice in a two-parent family between mum and dad. And we know that dads aren't. And that's such a pity. There was a recent article in the Sunday Independent from a young and new father who was talking about the fact that he had taken paternity leave with a very supportive employer, and the difference it had made to him. And it was a gorgeous article, and it is really important. And the sad thing is that a lot of families make an economic decision about that, which is completely understandable. If we had proper support, though, from the state and from employers, and a lot of employers would love to top up wages and they just can't, you would think that more dads would choose to do that, and that's so important for families to make choice. But it's interesting that support is there. And then the final one that we've asked for 5 years is about parents only paying towards provision in line with their overall income. And again, that has actually grown over the years, and then dipped a little last year, but 62% of people across the board agree. Of course, parents of young children agree even more. But that's what happens in other countries, and that's the direction of travel that Early Childhood Ireland wants to see here, that everyone contributes through taxation and something towards fees, but that there's a ceiling and a floor on that. And that's what works, and that's certainly what's in the best interest of children in terms of providing quality and flexibility to them and their families.
Yeah, it's so interesting. As I think we, in terms of the parental leave aspect, you mentioned that article. I remember reading that article, and the supportive employer was so important. So, you know, that, I suppose, education of the employer sector needs a little bit of work too, to kind of help them see that it's so important for children. So, Frances, thanks a million for taking us through the findings. It's so interesting. And, you know, looking at the dip last year when, you know, when the survey was taken, we were in lockdown, and the impact that had on people's opinions. It's fascinating. There's so much interesting analysis there on the barometer. So, Frances, thanks a million for joining us.
Thanks, Maura.
And thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends and colleagues, and we'll see you next time.